You're in the Commerce Committee room. This is a committee that I've been on for a long time. You'll see my picture up there. I had the privilege of being chairman of this committee for 14 years. When the House changed, I lost that privilege. It is one of the great privileges that you can get. This is the committee that was run by Sam Rayburn. It has the broadest kind of jurisdiction over the Commerce Clause, which means that almost everything that moves is properly considered here as a matter of legislative action by the Congress. I represent an area in the southeast corner of Michigan, which moves around every time we have a redistricting, and this means some rather nasty results in terms of primaries generally, in which I am in district with another member of Congress. That's happened to me twice since I came here, and it's quite an unpleasant experience, but we have always won, and we never doubted that we would. So that has all been to the good. I've had the privilege, as Ward did, of having a father who was a member of Congress, a very distinguished one, as was his dad, with whom I served, and who was a very fine and decent and able human being, and a very, very fine, indeed outstanding member of the House of Representatives. We served on a committee no longer existing called the Committee on Merchant Marine and Fisheries, which had broad jurisdiction in the area of conservation, fisheries, maritime matters, and things of that kind, in which he and I and others wrote some great pieces of legislation: Marine Mammals Protective Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, ocean dumping legislation, and a lot of other legislation to create and to protect the fish and wildlife refuge system, which is a great national treasure, which amounts to some 100 million acres or more of wildlands which are devoted to the protection of fish and wildlife, and which are there to provide also recreation for human beings. So it's a very valuable entity. I think I've talked enough. You have questions, and I want to be respectful of your concerns. So far away.
Congressman Dingell, before they start, when I was about 13 or 14, I used to come and watch you and my dad in the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee.
Great committee.
And Congressman Bonner was also, obviously an important.
And he was a great chairman, very able man.
I kind of went to school in the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee hearings, so I learned a lot there.
Well, your dad was a great man and a great friend of mine, which is one of the reasons that I'm here. And you can indeed be proud of him. He was a superb human being, and he was a gentleman in every particular, something which seems to be rather missing around here today. So fire away, kids. What do you got?
I'm Seychelle, and I'd like to know, with your father having served and represented for 22 years in your district, I was wondering if that influenced you to always want to be, and did you always plan on becoming a congressman?
Well, you're asking a very question that deals with the subjective. Frankly, I just asked my number 2 son, who is a circuit judge back home, whether he wanted to run for Congress when I quit. And he said, "No, Dad, I don't want to. You work too hard." And that doesn't mean I have any complaints. If I had, I wouldn't have stayed here this long. But I also saw how hard my dad worked. So I really, at an early age, had no intention of running for Congress. But when Dad passed on, all of his friends began to push and say, "John, we hope you will run." So I did. I figured, well, I'd try it for a few years and see how it worked. Well, as you can note, that those few years have grown into more than 50, and with the next coming election, there'll be more than 52. So you can obviously see that I not only have enjoyed it. I've been grateful for it. And the people of Southeast Michigan have been very good to me. Who's next?
Can you talk a little bit about how Congress has changed during your time here?
Before I do, tell me why you asked the question.
Well, because I'm curious. I mean, I read Tip O'Neill's book, and I want to know a little bit about the inside, what it's been like working here for you.
Well, if you got a couple or 3 weeks, we can address the matter. Let me tell you a little about the mechanical changes in this place. And let me tell you then about the other changes, which I'm sure you're really more interested in. My dad came here with Roosevelt in 1932. At the time, he had one room, one secretary, one typewriter, and one electric fan, no air conditioning, one round trip ticket between Michigan and Washington, which meant that the entire family drove down in the family car and stayed here. The session went on about 2 months. It started in April the 20th, although it moved up to March 20, and it ended punctually the 1st of June. That first year it went a little longer because that was the 100 days, as you'll recall, which you will hear spoken of with regard, because at that time the country was in the midst of a hideous depression. When I came here, I had 4 staff members, 4 typewriters, air conditioning, no electric fans, had 2 rooms where Pop had 1. I had 2 committee assignments, Merchant Marine being 1, and then Public Works, which is now Transportation and Infrastructure. And the sessions went from the 1st of January, because we eliminated the lame duck provisions of the Constitution. And the sessions started January 1. The lame duck provisions were put in because it took so long for people to get from wherever they were in their districts down here to Washington. And they finally did away with that because it led to some very mischievous legislative consequences. Today, we're in session practically year-round. When Dad came, there was a budget of around $6 or $7 billion a year. When I came, the budget was about 300 or thereabout, no, about 200 billion, $280 billion. Today, it's about $1 trillion. And there is the national debt now equals the national debt of the first 41 presidents of the United States. It is regrettable that this place probably has the most poisonous climate that it has had during the time that I have served. And it is done, and this is not a partisan speech, because it is a calculated plan on the part of my Republican colleagues that they will run this place to satisfy the far right. Clearly that is not going to satisfy me, and so I am excluded from the discussions. I have a rather good relationship with Joe Parton, who is the chairman of this committee, so we do talk about things, and we are able to, from time to time, actually work together on legislation. Although there's a lot of, in my view, unnecessary partisan fighting which has to take place. When I came, the Rules Committee would write a rule, and we would ask open rules, whereby the Congress had a chance to amend a bill any way they wanted, and we would pass the bill if it could. Today, the Rules Committee issues these straitjacket rules, which permit virtually no amendments, particularly those which the Democrats would want, and particularly those where the leadership would have a chance of losing. The conference committees, when Ward's dad was here, which used to be honest meetings conducted in closed sessions, but which were conducted in a very fair and even-handed way, are now oftentimes matters in which Democrats are just totally excluded. They don't even talk to us about that. We're not permitted in the room. When Ward's dad was here, we had a very bipartisan approach. There were great friendships across the aisle. There were, and his dad I had enormous respect for. He was one of my mentors and was a great human being. And a very, as I said, a very decent gentleman, which I mean is a high compliment. And the conference committees were open and rather were closed, but they were conducted in a very open fashion inside the memories. Today, we have open session, but when you see people talking, you'll observe them talking to the audience from up there, and you will not see them talking to each other, which is the way it used to be. We wrote legislation in conference or in subcommittee when I was a young member. We'd take off our coats, roll up our sleeves, fight like hell, say some appalling bad things to each other, and when it was all done, we would get up, shake hands, and walk out with our arms around each other as good friends. And we had a bill which we would defend against all comers, both Democrats and Republicans. That doesn't happen anymore. And you will find, if you look at the votes, that the votes will be straight party line votes, absolutely straight party line votes. That is the wrong way for the nation's business to be done. And some peculiar quirks in the rules. When we, for example, had Medicare Part D up, the vote went on for about 3 hours, and you could hear the bones breaking all over the room when they started twisting the arms of my Republican colleagues to vote for that legislation. Finally passed by one vote. That kind of situation has occurred on a number of other occasions, which would relate to budget and things of that kind. Again, this is not the way the Congress should be run, because it is not what they do for John Dingell, but rather it is what they do for the people that I serve. Remember, I am a servant of 700,000 people, and they're entitled as citizens to have their voices heard here. And I have the privilege of being their surrogate and representative who serves here. So the situation has deteriorated significantly, and I think one of the worries that I have is that if and one of the things my old-timer Democratic friends have is that when we take the place over, which we could very well do come fall, that you will see this kind of thing being accepted as the paradigm under which the Congress works. That is a very bad way for it to do. And I intend to try and avoid that, because I don't believe that that is in the interest of the country or the interest of the people, or indeed in your interests. All right, fire away. Next one.
Hi, my name is John.
Hello.
I was wondering if you could tell us about your first day in Congress.
Well, I came in the middle of the session. I was elected on December the 13th. My classmates all had been elected the November previous to that, not December of 55, but November of 54. So I came in, and one of the first things that they did was to swear me in as the newest member. I was also the youngest member. And they then did the housekeeping business of adopting the rules and all that sort of thing. I had a bunch of friends and family who'd come down to see me get sworn in, because that's a very important event in the family and friends. And then the House had what is called a special order in which the members discuss extraneous business. And that special order was to praise my dad for his service. That was quite an emotional experience for me, as I gather you could do. I also had to get my committee assignments. I got Merchant Marine Fisheries, which I didn't even know existed, but which turned out to be one of the great things that I did, because, as I mentioned, we wrote great legislation there, major conservation legislation. And I got Public Works Committee, which was a very important committee in terms of doing things that were important to my district, because I come from the Detroit River and the Great Lakes area, and Public Works is very important to that. Then we had some parties and all that sort of stuff, and then the day ended and I started going to work. I was fortunate in that I was able to hire my dad's staff, which was one of the best staffs on the Hill, and they contrived to make me, really just a blockhead kid, look like a pretty good member of Congress. So, who's got the next question?
I do.
Sure.
My name is Casey.
Casey.
As someone who has served through some of America's greatest and most dramatic transitions and events, is there any single event that stands out as having the most impact on you?
There are so many things which happen here that is very hard to give you an answer. I was a page boy, and I was on the floor of the House when President Roosevelt declared war on the Japanese. And 2 days later, when he declared war, the first one was the 8th of December. And 2 days later, when he declared war on the Germans, because they didn't declare war on us at the same time, I presided over Medicare when we passed that into law. That was something that I desperately wanted. I've handled more than a fair amount of legislation, conducted a number of investigations. I've had the opportunity to attend the inauguration of every president since I came here. I've had the privilege of working on some extraordinary pieces of legislation, some of which I've mentioned to you. I think there are moments of extraordinary drama and importance. And I've been, since 1955, in the midst of almost every one which has occurred here. Death of Kennedy, assassination of Martin Luther King, not the Korean War, but the Vietnamese War, which was a dirty mess. The fight which we had over whether or not we would go into Iraq or not. And the question of whether or not we would go the second time into Iraq. First time I voted for it, second time I voted against it. First time because it was necessary to do, second time because it was an act of the greatest folly. We didn't need to do it. But I've seen a lot of great men here. I arranged to have Lech Wałęsa, who was the first president of Poland after the communists, to speak here. And I've seen a lot of others of that quality. I've also seen some boneheads, but I've seen a lot of, this life of mine is a mixture between dealing with wonderful people, extraordinary people, taking care of people who have no way of addressing their business. And then I deal with a fair number of scoundrels and boobs. But that's part of the game too. Hi, sure.
In
In your years of service in the Congress, you've seen many people come and go. Were there any that stood out as great leaders or legislators?
Well, if you get here, you're pretty good, most of the time. I've seen some people that, frankly, I didn't think should have been here, either because of intellect or because of character. But for the most part, those people don't show, and they don't stay very long. So I've served with a lot of great people. My dad, let's see, Orrin, we had I gotta get his picture back up here. A guy by the name of Warren Harris, Bill Maillard, my mentors, Sam Rayburn and John McCormick, and people like, I've mentioned Warren Harris, Tip O'Neill. A lot of these names you won't recall, and I can't hold that against you or fault you for it, because the House is not a place which is, where we attract a lot of attention. We do the nation's business, and there's 435 of us, and so you don't hear a lot about most of us. But I've served, I've shaken the hand of Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy and Johnson, Nixon and Ford, and almost, well, every president. And I've had a chance to form some pretty good opinions of them, because not just of what I saw them do or read about in the papers or saw they did in government documents, but where I saw what they did in terms of their behavior as human beings, which is something where you learn. This is a place which has better than 1,000 years of tradition in it. It goes back to the Magna Carta, and actually it goes back to what the Norwegians used to call the Thing, which was their system of democratic government. And a lot of very wise men have learned a lot about this place, and the wisdom that they showed has gone into it. And the system, if it is permitted to work as it should, and I will say this is not partisan, they've not permitted it to do so for the last 14 years. But it will produce extraordinary good results from the standpoint of representing the people. And so that to me was always important. When I became a committee chairman, I was very much concerned, because this is a very big job. You have huge responsibilities. So I went over to the parliamentarian, who is the guy that tells us what the rules are and how we behave. And I sat down, we closed the door, and I talked to him, and I said, now, what am I going to do this job right? He said, John, you're going to have to do two things. One, you're going to have to be fair. And two, you are going to have to appear fair. That seems like the same thing, but take my word, they are very different. Who's got the next question? Hi.
There's a saying, great power comes great responsibility.
That's true.
Given your life experience in politics and from the research we've done on you, it seems you've accumulated a lot of respect and power within Congress.
Thank you. Thank you.
And influence on the issues. So what, And what is the responsibility of a man in your position?
Well, first, to remember that I'm a public servant. People don't work for me, I work for them. Second, to remember that I have a public trust of the highest order. Third, to remember that I have been given probably the greatest honor that can be given directly to a man by the voters. Remember, the House, when the Congress, when the Constitution was adopted, was the highest directly elected body in the government. President was not directly elected, Senate was not directly elected. And we really were, and should be, closest to the people. And so bearing that trust with integrity and decency and working hard is the real responsibility that I have as a member, and others do. And when those trusts are breached, it is a very serious event. When we have scandals involving misbehavior by members or something of that kind, that's an intolerable situation, and it brings shame on this institution, which is a great institution, and which is a part of, I think, the greatest government of the greatest country in the world, whose functions are set out in one of the greatest, not one of the, but the greatest governing document in the whole world. I'm talking about the U.S. Constitution. So I hold a public trust in people who have offices in government at any level, hold a public trust. Remember, I am called a representative in Congress. I'm not here. I'm here to do what's right, and I'm here to do what I think is right. But I also always have to remember that I'm supposed to serve the people. That's the important thing. Who wants to be next?
I was wondering if there's any time in your period of being in Congress, if you ever thought of giving up, if it was just too hard.
It's not too hard. God was very good to me. He gave me a lot of good health. I'm on crutches because I had a hip replaced, but my health is good, and I have been physically active all my life, very, very much so. And my health is good. So physically, it has not been hard. At times, it has been distasteful. And I have seen almost every one of my colleagues with whom I have been close suffer considerable disappointment or distress about the way the House goes. But in most instances, you get over it. Now, some members just up and quit. They don't usually resign, they serve out their term. But they do, for good reason, quit because they get discouraged or they get fed up or they've had enough or they're tired or something of that kind. I am uniquely fortunate in the family traditions and the fact that I've had an extraordinary district to represent. My people are extraordinarily good to me. But also that I've had an extraordinarily fine wife who has been a wonderful support and help to me. She's an absolutely fabulous woman. And not many members of Congress are so blessed. So I've done very well, and I've gotten disgusted, and I do fairly frequently, but I also get out of it, and I also remember that this is a great place, and we can do good, and we do good here, although rather less lately than we used to. Next question.
Hi, I'm Madeline.
Hi.
What kind of advice would you give to a new congressperson starting out?
Tell you the advice that I got and the thing that I learned from those who were my betters when I was a young member. And that is service. Look after your people. Take care of your people. If you will do that, you will be astonished at how they will take care of you. I still receive letters from people who I helped when I first came through the door, or whose parents or grandparents I helped when I came through here. I even still hear from some people that my dad helped. People don't forget that. And one of my smart colleagues the other day said, he said, when somebody brings me a problem, I don't regard it as a problem. I regard it as an opportunity. We're here to serve and to help and to work for people. And that's, if I were to tell any young member, I would say that. Get around and talk to your people, answer your mail, see that you communicate with people. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't do what you think is right if there's a political swell underneath you. When you get home, you should look. There's a great article by an English parliamentarian by the name of Burke, who describes the responsibility of an elected member of the British Parliament. This dates from 1750s or something like that. So it's a very old document, but it shows that they did. And he describes that his duty was to use his best judgment as a representative, and then to go home and justify and defend what he had done for the people and why. And he stayed around the Parliament for a long time, so apparently it worked for him, and it apparently worked well for me. Who's got the next question? Son. Hello.
I was wondering what achievement as a congressman has made you the most proud, and what do you most regret?
Well, again, you do so much, and so much happens to you and around you that it's pretty hard. I presided over the House when we passed Medicare. That was a big thing to me, and it still is. I authored the National Environmental Policy Act. That was a very important thing. I conducted an investigation that made the blood supply of the country safe and saw to it that things like AIDS didn't get in the blood supply. In France, they weren't so careful, and they had a hideous epidemic of AIDS over there, in good part from the blood supply. And we got on it early and fixed it. A lot of consumer legislation, things which were important. I'm in the process of building a little fish and wildlife refuge on the Detroit River. And we're working with Fish and Wildlife, and we've got about 2,200 acres, and if God is good and everything goes well, we'll have it up to 42, 43, 4,400 acres. Now, this is peanuts in terms of what really happens, but we saved the last open mile on the Detroit River, the last undeveloped, and it's a beautiful place. They've got trees there that are almost as big across as that table which you're seated at. So, there's some, and other things. So I have no right to brag. I've been lucky and I've accomplished a lot. And in part it's because I've been smart enough to know how the system works and to make the system function. So, and we've done a lot of things. We had, in the old days when this committee used to have used to have jurisdiction over railroads. We solved a railroad strike in 18 hours. Turned out to be one of the worst mistakes I ever made, because we did it so fast that nobody knew we'd done anything. And the next thing I knew, they didn't think we were doing anything about railroads, so they took jurisdiction of it away from us. So I'm a little more careful about things like that today.
I'm Andrea.
Hello, Andrea.
If there was anything that you could get the American public to understand about Congress that they don't already know, what would it be?
The American people get the kind of government they want. And they get the kind of government they vote for. And until they are more greatly involved in their government, they're going to continue to have a legitimate right to complain about the government and how it functions. They're also going, but one of the legitimate complaints that they're going to have is the way they're judging what the Congress should do and who they elect, or how they're not voting and not participating, which has, again, another serious adverse impact on government. That would be my advice. Who's got another question?
If you could give us a piece of advice for our generation, what would it be?
Keep the idealism I see here. This is a country which will only function if there is idealism. I would say involve yourself and participate. You don't have to run for Congress or run for president or anything like that. All you've got to do is to participate. But there's plenty of places where you can participate, either in the Republican, the Democratic, or some other party. There's plenty of offices that oftentimes go begging. School boards, city councils, and township offices, and Congress, and nonpartisan affairs that go on locally that are government units but are not elected. There's all kinds of things that you can do, and you really should. The Greeks had a word which they use, which I find to be very interesting. They use the word idiot. Now, you might wonder what idiot means, but to the Greeks, it meant somebody who didn't know or who didn't care. And more specifically, it meant somebody who didn't participate in his government. And you'll remember that the Greeks were amongst the first people who had democratic societies and democratic governments. At least the Athenians did. Spartans did not, but the Athenians did. One more question, and then you got to go, and one more question, and then I got to go. Who wants to be next?
Through all your years of public service, are there still things that surprise you every day?
Oh, sure.
And what sorts of things?
I wish I could give you an answer, but the world is full of surprises. This business is full of surprises. I can't think of any, but I would ask you to take my word. This place is full of surprises. And I'm sure that as you read the paper, you will find that you will see that somebody got surprised, whether it's an election that goes sour, or whether it's a bill that fails that everybody thought would pass, or a bill that passes that nobody thought would come up, or whether it's some kind of untoward event like December 7 when we had Pearl Harbor bombed, or 9/11 when we saw that terrible event in New York, and over at the Pentagon. The world is full of surprises, and you should just anticipate that they are going to be there, and that you are going to have many, and this country is going to have many, and you have to learn to have the intellectual flexibility to address them as they rise. Well, I want to thank you. You're a delightful bunch of young people. I hope you've enjoyed it.